How do we even get a deep state, and how do we put it back in its box? Blaze News The Mandate starts right now. Welcome in, everyone. I'm Jill Savage, joined by Editor-in-Chief Matthew Peterson. It's a Good Friday.
It's better than Good Friday. It's Friday, and that makes it a very special day. And this is a very special episode.
It is. So we have RJ Pestritto on. He's the graduate dean and professor of politics for Hillsdale College and a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. And this audience might know him as the guy who I think you could probably go out on a limb and say radicalized Glenn Beck when he was out there talking about progressivism. So he knows a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so look, all those names and credentials, whatever, normally I could care less, right? Professor, what does that mean? I was a professor, I know professors, who cares? But in this case, you're talking about someone who is in charge of really the only graduate school in America, or one of the only, you could say, probably the only graduate school in America that still reads the words of the founder documents, actually looks at American history, and understands the principles that made us great and the way in which constitutional government works. I can't tell you how rare that is. So his mind is very rare on this, and he's run that graduate school for a while, as well as being a senior fellow, of course, at Claremont, teaching a lot of the young leaders who are in the administration in the same program that I do. So that all is proven by the fact that at one point, not too long ago, it was really 10 years ago, Glenn Beck, in a way, took this professor and started to read his obscure book on progressivism and made it a very popular thing across the country, because Glenn really took to the history that RJ laid out about how 100 years ago, a lot of our problems started when the progressives started to change the way in which our federal government operates. And part of that is the biggest thing facing us right now, which is that the man who came up with the phrase, "you're fired," Donald Trump, can't actually fire anyone because of the last 100 years of progressivism in this country, even though it's obvious from the Constitution in the first 100 years of the American Republic that the president should, in fact, as the chief executive officer, be able to fire people. So we're going to talk about how Trump can say, "you're fired," again.
When I was just a mind full of mush, it was Rush Limbaugh that was teaching me that Hillsdale College knows a thing or two. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get straight into the interview with RJ Pestritto.
So Donald Trump is elected in 2016, and everyone in the country knows the show he was on, one of those popular reality shows in America, The Apprentice, in which his signature line was to look at the camera, look at the person and say, "You're fired. You're fired." And I don't think that was an accident, right? I don't think that was an accident. But if you look at this administration, round one and round two, you could look at it in a way as a quest to be able to say you're fired to the millions of people, right, who ultimately work for the federal government. And that is something that every conservative has talked about for decades, and yet it's a very difficult thing to happen. So, when we think about this, RJ, I think the problem is most people, regular people, still think logically about this, and they know that the president is the CEO or the chief executive officer of the United States of America, and they believe that he should be able to fire the people who work for him. And yet, here we are. So we're going to get into all that and what should be done about it. But first, we should start at the very beginning with the Constitution itself. What does that old document tell us about this matter?
Well, I think you framed it in the right way, Matt. One way I think to think about it is, as a basic question, is can there be people in the executive branch? Can there be people who carry out executive power in this country at the federal level who are somehow not answerable to the president? Right? Are there executive powers granted by the Constitution that don't come under presidential control? And the structure of the Constitution, of Article 2 in particular, which is the article that governs the executive branch, is it's a unitary understanding, which is to say there's only one official who is given executive power. That's the president. Now we know lots of people. There are lots of people in the executive branch. It's the most populated branch of government, of course. But really, they all, under our constitutional understanding, they all exercise power on behalf of the president, and so they have to answer to the president. And so, just like, as you say, just like in any organization where you have a CEO who's ultimately responsible for how that organization carries out the mission of its shareholders, or if it's a public corporation, or the mission of its board, the president has to be able to control his subordinates. He has to be able to appoint them and to remove them if necessary. That's why you and I have bosses, and that's how we answer to them. They ultimately are the ones who chose to hire us, and if we're not carrying out the job in the way that they want us to, they can fire us. And the other thing that gets added in here, from the framers' point of view, is this is absolutely essential in a republic, right? This is a self-governing system. So those who exercise executive power have to be answerable somehow to the people, right, who ordain and establish the Constitution. Well, the only way in which they can be answerable is that there's only one person who's elected, for whom the people vote in the executive branch. That's the president. And so if subordinates in the executive branch, if you have bureaucrats who are not fireable, who don't have to answer to the elected president, then the obvious question is, well, to whom do they answer? To whom are they accountable? And that's the real problem today, right? We have a lot of executive branch employees. Their boss ultimately is supposed to be the people of the United States, the citizens of the United States. But if the president isn't able to hire and fire, then what control do the people have?
And this is especially the case when we're coming off a time where we just had a president who is sort of a non-entity for a while, apparently. The office of the president was being talked about, whereas the person of Joe Biden was, we don't know where in his mind. And we have the use of the auto pen from the very beginning. I mean, this is very troubling, I think, to all Americans who are thoughtful about these things, because it was as if there wasn't a person there, right? The office was there. And that seems exactly the problem today, right? Where there doesn't need to be a person there, because you have a bunch of bureaucrats or other officials who are running things who are not able to be held accountable. And this is sort of a shadow office. But that's what we want to get rid of. And the question is, how the hell do we get into this situation where what you just laid out seems commonsensical? I mean, if they're not beholden to the president, who are they beholden to? Is this a Republican form of government? Do we have any authority over them? But so going back to the beginning, so the Constitution, is ratified, and in the early American Republic, how did this work then? And did they have to struggle with any of these issues or figure them out at the time?
Yeah. So there are kind of two sides of the question. There's your hiring and firing, and you could kind of treat each one in turn, because the Constitution is more specific about hiring than it is about firing. So there's a provision for appointment of executive branch officials in the Constitution, and basically the president appoints, the Senate confirms, and there's an exception to that for those who are considered to be inferior officers, and the Constitution provides some other possible modes of appointment for those inferior officers. But basically, the president hires. That's the core function of a chief executive, and the Senate has a check on that. With respect to removal power, that's the more interesting question, because, of course, the Constitution is silent in terms of who can remove executive branch officials. And the assumption is that essentially, if there's not something specific that's stated there, then the thing to do is essentially to look to the general nature. Well, what is executive power? Is it in the nature of executive power to hire and to fire? So historically, this was a question that wasn't fully settled at the Constitutional Convention. We know that the structure of the executive was one of the last remaining things to be settled on at the convention. and the question of presidential removal actually wasn't addressed at all. And so the historical debate really to look at that's most instructive is in the first Congress, right? So the Constitution is proposed, it's ratified, the very first election is held, and Congress, first Congress is seated. And it's kind of almost like an extension of the Constitutional Convention because, all of the players are there, as it were, and Congress is having to one of its very first duties is to set up the major executive branch departments through legislation. And there's a debate about, in these departments, we know constitutionally how these officials are going to be appointed. How are they going to be removed? And James Madison is in the middle of this debate and makes a very strong case that unless there is some specific exception stated, the Constitution gives the general executive power to a single person, to the president. And so it is simply assumed that if the president is going to be able to exercise executive power, he has to have the removal. And so there's a very robust debate about this in that first Congress. And it's really an extension of the discussion that we first see made by Madison's co-author of the Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton in the 70th Federalist Paper, which is where he explains why we have to have, in our system, we have to have this unitary executive. It's basically for two reasons. First of all, because executive power by its nature often requires quick action, requires decisive action, the kinds of things that an executive is required to do. They're often not the kinds of things you want to assemble a committee for. Let's say if the country's under some sudden attack, you don't want to get a group of people together and try to convene some debate. But the other even more important reason is
no committee meetings. We know how that works.
That if you have more, if you have more than one person involved, who is to blame? And so the people need to be able to hold the executive to account, and that can only be done through its unitary structure. So there's a very, as I said, robust debate about this at the time of the first Congress, and this is what's settled on. And then the major fundamental court case we have on this is basically quoting and taking from Madison's argument in that first Congress, and sort of putting forward this unitary executive understanding.
So let me see if I can sum this up. So the Constitution itself is clear about the president doing the hiring, doesn't say anything about the firing, but from the beginning, you had the first Congress trying to figure this out, and it almost sounds like a very legalistic argument, right? Because if you say, "Oh, wait a minute, it doesn't exactly say that the president can't fire," because as you're saying, Madison says, executive power is vested in the president, and presumably if he can hire, he can fire. And so that, would you say, it's sort of a settled issue, the president must be able to fire people in the days of the early American Republic?
Yes. Now, there are some controversies that creep up in the course of the 19th century, where when you have disputes between Congress and the president, sometimes Congress tries to intrude upon this authority. The Jackson administration would be one obvious example. This is really the source of the major dispute that Congress had with Andrew Johnson in Reconstruction, where the members of Congress tried to claw back some of that authority from the president. So you do have some instances historically where this question comes up, but really it isn't until the early part of the 20th century where it comes before the courts and where it gets a kind of full hearing, and we get into some of the disputes that you're starting to hear about today in terms of the bureaucracy and how much Congress can protect parts of the bureaucracy from presidential control. Those things kind of creep up in the 20th century.
So is it true to say, so let's look at just before that progressive era, which we'll get into in a second. You'll hear people say, well, the problem was the spoils system was in play. and that was what does that mean? I mean, what did this look like? Because what you're saying is, yeah, there was some controversy, but for the most part, you came in as president and you could fire whoever you wanted. You could fire lots of people, and you could hire lots of your own people, and no one would say boo about it. There was some issues with Congress's power going back and forth, and that is what people call the spoil system, no? And that sort of has a negative connotation, I guess.
Very much, yeah. The critics would say, well, look, the problem this creates is if the president is in control of all of the offices in the executive, then what that means is when a new president is elected, he can just give out jobs to all of his loyalists, to these amateurs, and then every 4 years or 8 years or however often there would be a change a change at the top politically, then it would be out with the old and in with the new, and you would get lots of turnover, and that jobs and work in the executive would sort of go off the basis of political loyalty and not off of expertise. And so the reformers for the spoil system, the early mugawump civil service reformers that you got, sort of in Reconstruction and thereafter, they tried to say, look, that there's a lot of what the executive does that shouldn't be involved in politics. It shouldn't be connected to politics at all. There are decisions. These are decisions that aren't really political. And so the most important qualification, they would argue, for someone in administration is not their loyalty to the elected president, but rather their expertise, right? So this is the dawn of kind of the power of science during the 19th century, and there's much enthusiasm about expertise and about university education, which is just starting to blossom in a sort of serious way in the United States in the second half of the 19th century. And the argument is, let's take all these kind of low spoil system kinds of politicians and get them out of here, and let's put in people who are just well educated. Let's put in people who are experts who it won't matter what their politics are. They can just govern according to what their expertise tells them is the right thing to do. And so century and progressive era arguments for what we have come to call the administrative state, and for having a whole class of bureaucrats that are sort of insulated from voters and they get to do their job independent of what voters think and how they're selecting their leaders. And so this is really the origins of the progressive movement in the latter part of the 19th century.
So let's So I mean, I want to play this up a little bit, because there's this plausible argument, right? I mean, you say, okay, I get the point. Like most people would say, even today, the president should be able to hire and fire. The president was hiring and firing. He could fire pretty much anyone he wanted to. But what happened is, he's hiring his, all his campaign people and their nephews, and you get these people saying, look, we're educated now. We have these universities, we have credentials, we know things about things, and this government has all kinds of offices, and we don't want this to be political, like you just said. Okay, well, that sounds plausible. You could almost say that there's a meritocratic element to that, right? I mean, you want people who actually know stuff about stuff in the job, right? And so how? But how does this? No, go ahead.
Well, I just say there are a couple of good questions there, right? First of all, one of them is we really have to look critically at this assumption that there are a bunch of decisions that administrators make that aren't political, right? That it's not a matter of left or right, this party or that party. They're just, you just want smart people doing the right thing, and so that's one kind of presumption to take a very close look at. Is that really right? Is it really true that people who are exercising power in the executive branch are exercising it in ways that that aren't politically significant and that shouldn't be accountable to voters, because that's the other question, right? What I mean, ultimately, what we're asking is, for someone in a position of power like this, what gives them their authority? Mm-hmm. Is it the fact that they have a university education? Is it the fact that they have some other claim to expertise? Or is it the fact that people have voted for them, that people can hold them to account? This is a republic, after all. And the idea of having a republic would seem to, I mean, how can you have a republic where people exercise authority and they're not accountable to voters?
Right.
Right. That's the bottom line. And, this seems like perhaps an abstract concept, but hopefully it got a lot more clear for people as we lived through the COVID pandemic. Mm-hmm. Right. If you think back to that very recent example, you don't need to go all the way back to the history of the spoil system. After all, think back to that very recent example, and here you have your public health policy, and so much of the calls that we had from the mainstream press, from the political elite, were keep the politicians out of it. We should just be having people who know about disease and pandemics, and people like Anthony Fauci and others. They should get to govern us because they're smart. They have medical degrees.
Trust the science. Exactly.
Trust the science. Well, the point is, first of all, you saw, number one, that the science was very much subject to the ideology of the scientists. Mm-hmm. That's number one. And number two, it's one thing to say that politicians should listen to science, that they should take very seriously the information and the knowledge that is provided to them through the various experts who are employed by the government or who are in private in the private sphere. That's all well and good and quite true. But it's another thing to say that the scientists themselves get to tell the government what they should do on the basis of the information they provide. Because, of course, it's not just a matter of, for example, how a disease is going to multiply and affect and spread. It's a question of, well, what kinds of policies, what kinds of restrictions on our freedom, let's say, are we willing to tolerate? How do we weigh certain choices of, health on the one hand and freedom on the other, economic prosperity on the other? These are political choices. We want to use the information very much that's given to us by the scientists when we can verify that it's not ideologically biased. But at the end of the day, the people have to govern themselves. They have to decide what is it that they want their government to do. And so that's a fundamental premise that is often obscured by this kind of carte blanche authority that some want to give to the administrators.
I mean, I really think COVID really is the greatest example recently. There's so many others though too, but I think we've seen in America that experts have been hardest hit by a lot of things that have happened over the last 10 years. I want to get to how the obstacles today and how we get past them, but just to put a fine point on it real quick, going back to the history. So how did the progressives really start to implement the policies and procedures that made it impossible for the president to fire everyone? Because this is really a sea change. We go from a system in which the president can fire pretty much everybody to not. So over the last 100 years, right? How did they put this together? What did they do?
Well, the first thing to understand is that government over the last 100 years, now maybe 90 years, I suppose you could say, is doing much more than it used to do. That is to say, the scope of government, the things into which the national government involves itself is so far beyond what the Constitution originally envisioned that the argument was now that the government was doing all of this additional activity, there was no way that a legislature, that a Congress could possibly keep up with making all of the specific rules and regulations, all of the legislating that is required to to manage all of the affairs into which the government has now gotten itself. So what do you do, right? Well, the argument of the progressives was Congress should essentially delegate very, very, very broad directives and very broad swaths of authority to administrative entities, right? So it should establish these entities in the bureaucracy. They should be staffed with experts, and to them would be delegated the task of coming up with the specific rules and regulations to manage all of the things into which the federal government had begun to involve itself that were just unprecedented at this time. And so, in a way, once we made that transformation, once we just changed utterly our understanding of the scope of government, then in a way the administrative state kind of followed as a logical necessity because Congress itself just simply could not do the job. And so this is where you got the advent of the social sciences, for example, the idea that the university could provide an education for bureaucrats that could then kind of be put in the hands of the state. And the argument was these people should be shielded from political control because what they were doing was well beyond the original political mission of the Constitution. And so this is where you had agencies being created, and then through things like civil service, or at the higher levels, the president would be prevented from exercising a full removal power. This was put into a lot of the laws at the time. So a lot of the agencies that were created both in the progressive era and in the New Deal era, Congress explicitly put in provisions. They would create these entities in the executive branch. Where else, after all, could they be? But the president was specifically prohibited from removing them. And you see this argument being raised now by defenders of the bureaucracy, saying, "Hey, this is illegal. Congress has carved out these agencies from being influenced by the president in this way." That's the argument you're having some 80, 100 years later.
Yeah, so let's go to that, because I mean, here we have, okay, so the president used to be able to fire people. Progressives say no. Congress says no, we're creating these executive positions, but actually the president cannot get rid of these people, is not in full control of them. All right, so what does the Trump administration do here? I mean, if the Trump administration says, well, I'm sorry, we don't think that that's constitutional, and we're going to fire these people, and this goes to the Supreme Court. I mean, what happens next? What are the obstacles there? Because I think for a lot of people, even people who are fairly political and care about this stuff, it still is sort of opaque, or like how it's like trying to grab water. Like, why can't we fire them? Damn it, right? So if the president says, okay, to hell with what you said, Congress. I'm going to fight this in the courts. What are the big looming obstacles that are in the way?
Well, I mean, the biggest obstacle is this is the way that we've done business now for almost 100 years. And
Right.
So in a way,
Right.
When you have the Trump administration coming in and saying, hey, actually, this isn't the way our system is supposed to work, from in the mind of most people, what is our system? It's the system that we've had in recent decades, and with all the precedents that have been established. And so it's very different than any recent understanding. But essentially, the turn of the tide here came in the 1930s. Congress was enacting statutes where it would create agencies in the executive branch, but would say, well, this is part of the executive branch that the president doesn't really get to control, so we're not going to allow him to have a full removal power. And the courts really started to let those statutes stand. And that started in the 1930s. I think now many folks paying attention have heard of the Humphreys Executor v. United States case from 1935. This is one of these cases where people previously hopefully had never had occasion to really think much about. But that was the famous case that upheld the Federal Trade Commission and the way that the Congress had structured it, and basically protected the Federal Trade Commission from the removal power of the president. And the court said in that case, this ironically is FDR who tried to remove a pre-New Deal Federal Trade Commissioner, and the court said in that case, well, that's okay. We think Congress happens in the history of the Supreme Court from the point of view of being true, faithful to the original constitutional understanding. And so that is the decision now that the Trump administration is up against. And I think what is going on there, and again, I have no inside information on this, of course, but I think that the folks in the administration who work on these things, they see in the courts an opening, maybe not in the lower courts, certainly, but at the Supreme Court level, to revisit this very grave constitutional error from the 1930s. And the court has certainly given some indications in recent decades that it is open to trying to restore a more constitutional understanding to how the executive branch is run. There was a case that President Trump won back in May. It was a preliminary go at it, but where the court indicated that it was sympathetic to allowing the president to have a more robust removal than what has been the practice over recent decades in some of these agencies. So I think they see that as an opening. It's very frustrating because obviously the lower levels of the courts, it's easier to judge shop. You're getting a lot of roadblocks, but these things are starting to percolate up to where the adults are in the judicial branch. And so I think they're going to start to see some more success. I'd be happy to talk more about that if you want to go in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important because so there's a number of things to talk about in order to solve the problem. How do you actually say you're fired to the administrative state? But here, I mean, this is very concrete, right? You're saying in 1935 there's a decision where the court and the court has used this ever since. Says no, these guys are protected from the executive, and he cannot, in fact, fire them, despite the fact that going back to the Constitution, these things were argued about, but it was generally accepted that he could, fire most people. So that's very concrete. Like, okay, and I'd like to hear more of this even from the administration, where people just say that decision needs to be overturned. That was unconstitutional. And we need to knock that back, because I think that's a clear explanation, right, for people in the audience. Like, okay, so the Supreme Court is a real problem here. They said something that really they don't have the backing for. Let's have that debate because we don't want to just base the Supreme Court decisions. The administrative state gets to stay because that's the way we've done it for the last however many decades. And people are ready for change. So, I mean, what do you think that's right? I mean, they should just take aim at this case and say, no, this is unconstitutional. It was an error, and we got to overturn it. Do you think they will, or did they understand this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's likely to happen. I mean, first, I should say, and this goes with a lot of what's going on today. We're having these battles in the courts. There's a better way to do this. The better way to do this is for Congress to understand the Constitution, for Congress to take back on its own constitutional authority, and for it to understand that these laws are wrong. I mean, this is the administrative state is a creature of Congress. It was created by Congress. Congress enacted it by statute, and Congress is the one that has put into place, all of these broad delegations and all of these sort of strange, carve outs for bureaucrats who are protected from presidential control. Congress can undo this anytime it wishes, and that's certainly the more straightforward path. That would involve a lot of fighting in Congress, but after all, I mean, that's what we're supposed to have elections for, getting things done. But elections come and go. Congress kind of, as everybody has seen, kind of hides, and so unfortunately, it has fallen to the courts, which in our system is really not the way it's supposed to operate. But when Congress has abdicated its role, then there's no other choice. There's no other avenue. And so these things are litigated. I think to turn to the second part of your question, the case in May was very telling. The case called Trump v. Wilcox, and it pertained to a member of the National Labor Relations Board, which by law the president is not supposed to be able to remove. But in this case, the president did remove the commissioner. This was overturned by the lower courts, but then on appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States, the Supreme Court said, "Look, we're sympathetic to the president here. We think that this commission exercises considerable executive power. Mm-hmm. We think, therefore, that there's no constitutional justification for allowing for limiting the president's control over it, and it allowed the president to go forward in this."
All right.
That encouraged the president, in turn, to make some other high-profile removals. Mm-hmm. Specifically, there's 3 members of the Consumer Product Safety Commission who were recently removed. The courts have stymied that removal at the lower level. That is now being kind of percolated at the Supreme Court level. So I think they're ultimately likely to prevail on a lot of this, I would have to say. That would be my prediction.
I mean, this is what's so exciting about what's happening. It's not all happening at once, and people need to realize how far we need to go, right? But we're starting to see percolating actual action, right? Pushing the courts. So I want to run through the other 2 branches in the time we have left. So we just went through the courts. I mean, the fact that there is this precedent that the president can't actually fire people. The Trump administration is pushing that. You're saying, and rightly, that as you go up the ladder where the adults are in the courts, they recognize that there's not really a good argument for this at all. And the Trump administration has shown that it can win here when he just starts doing it and removing people. But nonetheless, as you say, Congress is the one that could easily, roll all this back, right? Now, the problem with Congress, of course, is you say if they actually understood the Constitution, I think there's more people every year in Congress who understand Instagram pretty well. And social media, a lot of influencers in that body. But they created it, and now they're a creature of it, right? So that is the place probably where a lot of people feel the most hopeless who think about these things. What the hell do you do about Congress? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like what resuscitates Congress? How do you, when you look at this now, you look at this, you get to know these people. It's really depressing, to be honest. That's the area in which you throw up your hands and say, what the hell do we do? But do you have any thoughts about what could be done?
Yeah, you're quite right that Congress seems to be more of a place for people who want a platform than it is for people who want to carry out constitutionally mandated legislative duties. I think the major obstacle right now to Congress doing its job is the filibuster in the Senate, because, when you have elections and members of Congress compete on major questions and the public weighs in through an election, you can't get anything done because of the filibuster hurdle. The filibuster, of course, people think this kind of is handed down from the founders. Long story short, it wasn't. It's an invention. It's a supermajority device. It's actually the kind of device in a legislature that the founders argued against because they thought it was un-Republican. So they thought it gave the minority to the ability to control a majority, which would be un-Republican. And so, I think if we didn't have the filibuster right now in the Senate, you'd be able to enact a lot more of these reforms straightforwardly. The issue there, a lot of times that's nails on the chalkboard to a conservative, because conservatives worry about overactive government, and the filibuster over the years has had the tendency to kind of gum things up and stop government from doing a lot of things. Mm-hmm.
All right, last, let's go to the presidency itself. We talked about what needs to happen in the courts, what needs to happen in Congress. I will say about Congress real quick, I do think that the one solution would be a really strong leader, right, in the presidency, like you see Trump doing now, leaning on everyone and telling them this is what you have to do. But the path to that is obviously tricky, given that so many of them are beholden to the administrative state. But in any event, What do you think President Trump should do? If you're advising the office of the presidency right now, how do you break that down? What are the things he should do to regain or to use the power that he should have to fire the administrative state?
Well, first of all, I think you're right that the president is providing the kind of leadership that Congress could take advantage of if it were of a mind to do it. I mean, think about the Doge spending cuts and how there's been no will in Congress at all to do anything about spending. And think about the spotlight that the Doge efforts shined on all of these ridiculous expenditures when that was really up and running in the first part of the Trump administration. That was a gift to Congress. It's been very difficult for Congress to cut spending as a rule, but here Trump, through his leadership, had put a spotlight on all of these things that like 90% of the country would agree were absolutely ridiculous and should be cut. And Congress could have taken that ball and run with it. That was an opening that they haven't had in decades and decades. And instead, you see them squabbling about some of the smallest cuts and, acting like they're being raked over hot coals and tortured for things that are tiny fractions of what the federal government actually spends money on. So that's a real lost opportunity. In terms of other things that the president can do, I think it's being done right now. I think that they are being very aggressive in the courts because that's the only forum that is left to them since fellow Republicans in Congress aren't willing enough to take the fight in the legislature. So you go in the courts and you press it, and they're doing that. They're taking it on the chin on a lot of these district courts because it's easy to judge shop. But you have to remember the president's been in office now for 7 months. This is relatively early in his administration. They already have had a lot of very big questions pushed up to the Supreme Court level where they have, by and large, been winning. Not in every instance and maybe not exactly in every way that they would have wished, but by and large, they've been winning. These things are percolating up, and it's only a matter of time. So I think they need to keep pressing on that. And I think the Supreme Court has to be very careful because if it doesn't continue to intervene and even intervene more aggressively with what's going on at the lower courts, they're really going to put the executive in a very difficult position. They're going to create a crisis of legitimacy for the courts themselves. And so I think right now it's keep on doing what you're doing, keep pressing the issues and publicizing the issues that the public is with you on, on the immigration, on cutting the ridiculous spending, on especially, getting the criminals who aren't supposed to be in the country out of the country. I think these are all things that will bear fruit. They've borne fruit already, and they're going to bear even more fruit in time.
Professor Pestritto, Hillsdale College, pleasure to have you on. Won't be the last time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Enjoyed it.
Talking about firing people out of the deep state, it fires me up for the weekend. So, Matt, let's get to some of your biggest takeaways. Your conversation with RJ, there are so many different aspects to what needs to happen to take down the deep state, the administrative state. But this is one of them that is front and center right now.
Yeah. So look, I don't think that most of the policy issues everyone's talking about every day really matter if the president can't actually fire and isn't actually in charge of the people under him in the federal government. I mean, is he the CEO or not? The CEO is able to fire everyone. And if the president of the United States cannot fire these people, then who are they accountable to? As the good professor said at the beginning of that interview. Then we don't live in a constitutional republic. We don't live in a Republican form of government if that's the case. That's becoming more apparent to more and more people every day. So when we run through what he said, we look at the branches. First, the courts. The Supreme Court has precedents from a very bad decision in the 1930s where it essentially said, no, you can shield a lot of these people from the president, and the president can't actually fire them. That court case needs to be overturned, and we need to return to the first 150 years of jurisprudence in this country where the president could fire. So we need to directly take aim. And the Trump administration, as he said, is doing that. They have a lot of great lawyers in there who understand this. But they need to make that clear, I think, to the public as well, that, look, the courts have said that the president can't fire everyone. That's ridiculous. Of course he can, or we don't have a constitutional republic, right? So you fight it in the courts. And at the top level, as RJ said, the top level, the courts are actually much more friendly than they used to be to this argument, because there really isn't a logical argument in my mind against it at all. So that needs to be pushed to the max. Then there's Congress. You and I like to talk about Congress. Chris Bedford is a Congress guy. We talk about Congress a lot. And of course, Congress is where you say it's hopeless. Congress created this beast by its legislation, by giving away its power. Congress just says they don't actually legislate laws, right? They say, we're giving all this power over to you and you can be unaccountable with it. Well, that has to end. How do you get that to end when Congress created something that then they became a creature of? I actually think there is a solution to that. I think that if you have powerful enough leaders, as you see with Trump leaning on people, and you start telling them exactly what to do to dismantle this thing, I actually think you can push them on the right. And if the Republicans win enough and have a winning coalition, and they have strong enough leaders who push them, right, and punish them if they remain creatures of the administrative state, as we will do on this show and on this network, a little bit of carrot and stick, I can actually see a change there, because here's the thing. If you are just an influencer, it doesn't matter. You don't care about policy anyway. So if I tell you what to do, right, and say, this is what you need to be popular, they'll go and do it. So there's actually, I don't think it's hopeless, but of course, that's the biggest question mark. And then there's what should Trump be doing now, right? And that's pretty much everything. Everything. There's some things we didn't even talk about, like declaring parts of the administrative state unconstitutional and saying I'm not going to regard them as in existence lawfully. But we pretty much got through, everything is they have to push. But the big thing is all these little things don't matter if we can't message from the White House that if the president cannot fire these people, he's not really president and we don't really have a constitutional republic.
And you see it right now, how they're trying to push back in this administration and trying to fire people. And they are firing people right now at the Department of Education and the State Department. We just saw them walking out with all of their things. And they were just, crying on the streets.
Yes.
Okay, well, 1,300 of you at the State Department probably needed to lose your jobs. This has become so big and so massive. This is the first time that there has been any take back from the administrative state.
Yes, and what you see is, as he talked about in this interview, he's just straight up removing some key offices and saying, you're fired, right? And then state and others are going, but these are huge departments, right? But they're getting rid of, little, chipping away, the 1,300 people, that's nothing, okay, good. And they're pushing. And as they push, there are going to be more and more battles, and we're going to take this all the way home, and it's going to come down to, can the president fire anyone or not?
A pink slip for you, a pink slip for you, a pink slip for you. That's how we're going to end it for the weekend. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you back here on Monday.